Hey guys, welcome back. It's Meg. Today we are going to talk about what Mistweaver actually is versus what people think it is, and then also attempt to clear up a couple of different misconceptions that people may have about the spec, whether from an outside perspective or if you're looking into playing Mistweaver in Dragonflight, you might be curious if any of these things that people are saying are true. So I'd like to go over all of those things, and we are going to start with what is Mistweaver. Whenever someone talks about Mistweaver, other terms that usually get thrown around are things like fist weaving, misweaving, ranged weaving. I've even heard stuff like kick or punch weaving. All of these things are either incorrect or just outdated terminology to reference the current recommended playstyle of the spec. So when someone mentions kick weaving or fist weaving, what they're actually referring to is the playstyle of Mistweaver surrounding Rising Mist, Ancient Teachings, and the general idea of doing damage during downtime when healing is not required, while having that damage translate into maintenance healing or mana regen. Something I really want to drive home is the fact that not all of our healing will come from HOTS or from damage to healing interactions. That is only meant to be maintenance healing, and it isn't designed to cover all of the damage going out. We still cast Vivify a lot, as well as occasionally be using Soothing Mist for heavier single target damage. So when people say fist weaving or kick weaving, what they're referencing is the playstyle that we are currently recommending in PvE content. When someone mentions ranged weaving or misweaving, what they're implying is that they have a desire to not be in melee at all and playing this modified or handicapped version of Mistweaver. These playstyles are not recommended in PvE. Even if we play more of a caster-centric build, we're still going to be DPSing in the downtime, and we are still targeted by melee mechanics regardless of talent selected or our positioning. So while Mistweaver is a melee healer, we are not hard tied to melee. One of our greatest strengths is the ability to float out of melee and still do effective healing, but you do need to prioritize getting back into melee range, otherwise mana might become an issue. So what Mistweaver actually is a very versatile and very flexible healer that should aim to be in melee a majority of the time while maintaining the group health through HOTS and smaller passive healing instances, but we're not punished as hard if we do need to step out to handle more serious damage through casting. We're going to be spending time stepping in, stepping out of melee to handle various mechanics and damage profiles, and ultimately we're one of the more flexible healers in terms of positioning. Something else that gets brought up a lot is the utility. A lot of people think that Mistweaver doesn't have utility or that our utility isn't good enough to get us into groups, but in reality our toolkit is actually very diverse and strong in Mythic Plus. We have access to Ring of Peace, Leg Sweep, Tiger's Lust, Song of Chi-Ji, Diffuse Magic, Ox Statue, Spearhand Strike, Paralysis, Mystic Touch, Generous Pour, Disable, and Revival. Some of these things are non-specific to Mistweaver and are just on the general monk class tree, but it is a lot of crowd control that we have at our disposal, and depending on your comp, you can actually contribute to a lot of stops and be a driving force in terms of CC. With Tiger's Lust, we are also capable of helping the tank gather mobs quickly because it is a speed boost, but it is also a anti-snare / anti-root. It kind of works like Freedom, but it does have to be used after the fact. Diffuse is kind of a pseudo-spell flex, so that can help us contribute to damage some, as well as kind of cheesing certain mechanics. With our Mystic Touch, we contribute to 5% physical damage as well. Though it doesn't show up on the meters for us, we know it's there in our hearts. Ox Statue is something that is worth experimenting with. It is a pretty niche ability, but we do have access to it now, so that can also help with some mob control, because a lot of these bosses actually do have adds spawning during the encounter. And of course we have Revival. This is a classic Mistweaver ability. It is a master spell. It also has a little bit of a heal portion and an interaction with our mastery, but it is mainly used as a master spell. I don't want to call this next one a misconception because it is technically true, but something that I do get a lot is that people think that Mistweaver damage is really low. And historically, yes, it has been, but I do think that Season 2 of Shadowlands really skewed a lot of players' perspectives on what healer damage should be looking like, mine included. With the current tuning at least though, this has been normalized a bit. I'm hoping that the trend of high healer damage drops off quite a bit, and with the dungeon design in Dragonflight, it's looking like healers will be back to mostly striving to meet healing checks rather than damage checks. So while it is technically correct that Mistweaver damage has been low historically, it's not necessarily something that will remain important as it has been before, and it's an important factor to reevaluate frequently. Going into Dragonflight, based on the current tuning and just kind of how things are laid out, Mistweaver damage is definitely higher on AoE, which is like 5 or more targets, but we also have really solid DPS with the new Blackout Cleave interaction for like 2 to 4 targets. That is also very strong. Our single target is what ends up dropping us off in terms of healer damage across the board, but our AoE is still very strong, as well as our cleave. So that's something to look forward to. It is definitely way better than it was in Shadowlands, and we also have access to benefit off of that newfound damage and translate it into healing as well. Mana is a topic that comes up probably as frequently as the DPS discussion, and this one gets a little bit complicated. Ultimately, Mistweaver mana management comes down to the dungeon that you're doing, your group, the affixes, the routing, and the key level. There's a lot that really influences how we use our mana, but there is also ways to be extremely efficient with it if mana management's your focus. Spirit of the Crane and Manatee are both accessible in the new trees, which is nice, but it is also up to the player to manage our healing to give us an efficient mana pool. Healing efficiently by extending hots and allowing those to do maintenance healing, as to not overextend yourself trying to vivify every single bit of damage, as well as not overusing things like Feline Stomp, Essence Font, and Enveloping Mist, as well as making sure that you are properly utilizing things like Revival, Life Cocoon, and Chi-Ji. In the past, mana has definitely been a limiting factor for Mistweaver, and while we do consume mana at a bit of a faster rate than most other healers, we're also in control of it, and we can burn our mana to exert a large amount of healing that some other healers may not have access to on demand like Mistweaver does. It does also allow us to cover mistakes very easily because we do have on-demand healing, but it does come at a bit of a higher cost. So this is something that gets easier as we start to learn the dungeons and start to know where defensives go and know what packs to avoid, and just kind of learn the general damage patterns for things like defensive cooldowns and for healing cooldowns. So ultimately you can be as aggressive as you want with your mana pool, but ultimately it does come down to being efficient, like I mentioned earlier, with your hots and keeping those extended, as well as making sure that you're utilizing your cooldowns properly. Something else I hear quite often is that people think that Mistweaver is incapable or struggles with healing AoE damage. While we don't have something like Tranquility, Hymn, or Spirit Link, with proper setup we do have access to AoE healing, and our cooldown Chi-Ji handles AoE damage very well, especially if your group is standing relatively close to each other. With proper Renewing Mist setup and Vivify Cleave, you can also utilize your Manatee, as we mentioned earlier. If you were going to be doing a lot of AoE healing, you're able to keep the group topped or at least healthy enough to survive the AoE, and then you can triage through either doing damage to do healing, or you can continue to Vivify depending on what your mana looks like. But overall, we do actually have a very good toolkit for AoE healing, especially if you utilize things like personal defensives, Life Cocoon, and even your Revival if you want to commit that as well. Alright, so I think that I got all of the big ones, or at least the most important ones in my opinion, just to touch on. I hope that this video was helpful. If you guys have any additional comments or questions, feel free to hit me up on Twitch, Twitter, or Discord. I will do my best to respond there. I'm also fairly active in Peaks, so you can ask there as well. But I hope that you guys learned something, or that it maybe cleared something up, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching!